Chris Southworth is the Secretary General at the International Chamber of Commerce UK, a trade body that internationally, I wrote the number down actually, Chris, because I thought I might forget it, that represents 45 million companies on the world stage, with particular reference to intergovernmental activity and the World Trade Organization, the United Nations and the G20. Just to clarify, because a lot of people are marching around the place saying things like this. Richard Tice, the Brexit Party chairman, said, "Our government hasn't yet asked for an Article 24 agreement under the WTO, whereby you'd basically have a 2-year standstill. It's extraordinary that they didn't ask for that." Do you understand what he's saying?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, but ultimately, to have any type of agreement like that, you need to agree that with your partners, and in that case, that's the EU, and that's not on the table. So,
which they've made repeatedly and crystal clear.
Absolutely. But if the EU and the UK go into the WTO and say, "Okay, this is what we want," then I'm sure the WTO would listen to that. But you can't do that on your own. It's a negotiation. It's a deal.
In fact, it's entirely in the gift of the EU, because if we've already said, if people like Tice have already said, this is what we want, the decision is taken by the remaining European Union members.
Yeah, and it also misses the point that once you leave the EU, if that's actually what's being asked, you're still trading on the same terms. Then in other words, you've left but you haven't left, and that would be odd for the EU to agree to something like that.
Otherwise, there's no point being in the EU.
Or leaving it. Yeah.
What is the WTO terms then? And to talk us through what this actually means.
Well, I think, first of all, the WTO, when you're operating in the EU, you're dealing with 27 countries, you're operating as one bloc. The EU itself is one of the 3 major power players in the trading world, with the US and China obviously being the other 2. But you're ultimately operating in a very aligned bloc. You have common positions and so on, and common trading rules. When you come out of the EU, you're moving into an institution, the World Trade Organization, where you're dealing with 150 countries. You're operating on your own. You're not in a bloc. You need to build alliances within that to get stuff done. And you have lots of differing interests. In other words, it's a much, much more complicated animal. And so the idea of leaving and then operating on WTO rules, which, as I said earlier, is the sort of very basic safety net that no country really operates on, you've got to be incredibly sophisticated and understand what your abilities are within that institution to be really effective in it.
And what does favoured nation mean? I hear that phrase quite a lot.
Well, I mean, most favoured nation status is really about establishing a common level playing field for everyone. So if you agree something with one country, then that applies to all countries. So it's a principle of fairness. It's a slightly technical term, but ultimately it's about being fair. That you can't have, a series of trading terms with one country and then have a different set of terms with another WTO member. You have to apply it across the board.
So trade agreements are a way out of most favoured nation status issues, because if you've got a free trade agreement, then only the signatories to that operate under its terms. Other countries can't sell into that market on the same terms and conditions.
Well, that's a really interesting question, because at the moment, the WTO historically obviously is focused on what they call multilateral deals. So one set of rules for everybody, and that deals with the most favoured nation status issue. At the moment, there's 4 work streams on a plurilateral basis, which means it's sort of 77 countries of the 150. And then there's a really interesting question that if those 77 countries agree, for instance, they're negotiating on digital trade right now, a deal on digital trade, actually under WTO rules, everybody benefits, whether they're in the negotiating group or not. But you can supplement that with your own preferential terms on a bilateral basis. So if you look at a country like Singapore, both Singapore and the UK support the negotiations on digital trade, but the negotiations are likely to come forward with a sort of a common position which is below the standards that Singapore and the UK would want to trade, and so they'll supplement that with a more sophisticated relationship at a bilateral basis.
So it's the point below which you cannot go, essentially, and everybody would rather be above that point, but it's an internationally agreed. See, this is part of the problem, actually, just to veer off piste briefly. This is complicated and occasionally quite dense stuff. I mean, you're explaining it more clearly than anyone else I've encountered. But on the other side of the table, you just have some Herbert shouting, "Take back control," or "Make America great again," or "Down with the EU." There's no easily administered pill on your side of the argument to bring home to people just how complicated the reality is and how dangerous it is to pretend otherwise. That must be very frustrating.
Yeah, something we're talking a lot about at the moment within the business community is the need for diplomacy, both political diplomacy but also business diplomacy. You know, talking in those kind of terms, it just comes across really poorly.
Yes.
In an organisation that is political, and you have to really respect the relationships, because obviously if you want to do deals or you want to get things done, it's all about the relationships you have with those countries. So if you go charging around making accusations or strong statements, clearly that offends people. Then defences go up and it becomes much harder to do things.
Can you see when reality does bite, the World Trade Organization becoming the next scapegoat in the way that these people have falsely blamed Brussels or falsely blamed the European Union for X, Y and Z? And, you know, who elected the Director General of the World Trade Organization, for example? I could imagine that being a Daily Express headline. Rather than blame themselves for having led Britain down this path, they'll try and blame it on unelected bureaucrats at the World Trade Organization?
Yeah, there's always an element of that, and you can hear pockets of that conversation. The same applies to the UN as well. But I think we need to recognise the achievements of these organisations. It's very difficult to get the world to agree on anything. You know, there's a terrific diversity, a lot of different needs, all of which need to be respected. But the WTO ultimately has been pivotal in reducing poverty by 40% and quadrupling global GDP.
But the European Union has been pivotal in increasing prosperity exponentially and safeguarding peace across the whole of continental Europe. So these little observations don't necessarily butter any parsnips, as they say.
No, but you know, it is important to keep reminding everyone of the benefits that they provide. And also, you know, okay, you attack the WTO, and then okay, let's just assume that you remove the WTO. What are you going to replace it with? You know,
well, there's a question.
It would be like, you know, removing all the road rules in London and then expecting everyone to drive in an orderly fashion.
Don't ring me to offer your support for the idea of removing all the road rules in London and having a kind of anarchist free-for-all on the streets of the city.
But that's an analogy the WTO use. You know, ultimately, it's there to provide rules so that we can all have an orderly set of relationships
do you know
trade
what?
together.
It's a very pet subject, this, because I'm a little bit more fascinated by words than is normal. If we changed regulations and called them protections, the whole debate would change. I think if people feel that if I tell them that there are regulations being put in place, they can be persuaded to feel aggrieved by that or squeezed by that. If you call them protections, which is of course what they are, and it's why the analogy of road rules, road protections works so well, then it just feels very, very differently in the ear.
Yeah, I mean, good regulation. I mean, ultimately, it's about good regulation, right? I mean, good regulation is there to enable us to live and do business in a safe way, in a good way.
Yes.
That's good regulation. And there are lots of good examples, whether it's wearing seatbelts in cars or not using mobile phones in cars, whatever that might be.
Crash helmets.
And there are
construction site protections, high visibility
examples
jackets.
of bad regulation, but those are in a tiny minority. You know, and that applies the same in the WTO. The rules in the WTO are there to help protect everyone in the world.